So, welcome to everybody that's joining us. I'm really excited for this one today. It's going to be fantastic. It's going to be interactive. So I hope you're ready for some fun and some really great resources. But welcome. We are on the fourth day of Generator's Emergency Response Program. Today, our webinar is titled Mental Health and Wellness Resources for Small Business Owners During This Time. I'm really excited to have it. Again, thanks to our partners, Enmotion and the Lincoln Partner for Economic Development, for really helping us get this program so quickly off the ground and spread around the state so effectively. So thank you again to them. Again, for those that you're familiar with this, for those that are not, if you're having issues with your Wi-Fi and your computer while you're listening in, know that there is call-in info. Just type in this number on the screen. It'll ask you for the webinar ID. You just type that in on the keypad, and it should enter you right away into the webinar as well. 4 questions during today's webinar. You'll see the Q&A box at the bottom there. We'll be able to show answered questions. This will be a little bit more interactive. So please, type into there as much as you want. We'll be able to jump in and, share with Marianne, our speaker today, everything that you're doing. And you should be able to raise the raised hand function as well, should be down there. But if not, know that Q&A box is something you can type right in and it goes directly to us on this side. If, for some reason we just run out of time, there's so much going on and we run out of time, feel free to still send in your questions. Don't send them in anonymously because we do want to get back to you. And then also feel free to just shoot me an email, danny@generator.com. I'm happy to, help you out and set you up with the appropriate resources and try to answer your questions to the best of our ability appropriately. Unfortunately, again, if we do have some technology issues or if you're having individual tech issues, we won't be able to help due to just the high volume of people in the webinar. But do know that, if it all hits the fan, we do record these and this will be up on the Generator Resources page under the Emergency Programs tab, and you'll find a link that says Resources there. Go there, you'll find everything under the sun for you there. And then without any further ado, I want to introduce our good speaker today. So Marianne Worthington, she's the founder of, founder of Work Now, and she's going to be fantastic. So without any further ado, I'm going to stop my share, Marianne, and I am going to highlight you as the spotlight, and feel free to just take it right away.
Oh, okay. So good morning, everybody. My name is Marianne Worthington, and I am your presenter today. And I am really, really excited to be here. I saw that Enmotion was a sponsor, helped with this event, and it was, oh my gosh, like a million summers ago. I was actually their team builder for a summer, and basically what that means is I was just known as like the drunk aunt. But it was really awesome to be involved in like the startup world. I did my own stuff in the social impact arena, and then moved more towards corporate America and working with them as my primary markets. But I'm very excited to be here. And we are going to talk about one of my most favorite topics, which is mental health and self-care. And what I have decided to do is, you'll notice that this is very, very casual. And so we've got Danny that's monitoring the chat room and the Q&A. So please don't feel like you have to wait until the end to ask your questions, because sometimes this flows a little bit better if you know that you can ask them at any time. But in preparing for today, what I decided to do is pull together the best resources that I have found over the course years, actually, and what can we do in dealing with times right now. And I believe in full transparency. And so I will let you know that the past, I've been at home, social distancing for 4 weeks now. I don't know, 4 weeks, 12 weeks, 10 years, it kind of all feels the same. And it has not been the easiest journey for me. I spent 5 years on the road every week. And so to kind of have all of that grounded and halted has been an interesting transition. And so I have had to be very, very careful when it comes to my own sanity and my own mental health. And so in order to do that, what I thought that I would do is start by talking to you all about one of the best articles that I have ever read in the history of ever that kind of describes what's going on right now. So in full disclosure, I love feelings. I think that feelings are amazing. I think that feelings are awesome. I think most people hate them. And so a lot of what we're going to talk about today is how do you deal with those big feelings? Because that's a huge part of mental health. So anyhow, the article that I want to talk to you all about was found in Harvard Business Review, and it was called "That Discomfort That You're Feeling is Grief." And what I will do is actually send that link to Danny. And so if you all after this want to actually read the article itself, it is well worth the read. And in fact, I do a lot of management training, and I say that it is a must read for all managers out there. But anyhow, the whole purpose of this article was talking about how there are so many feelings going on right now that we aren't used to. And so how do you label those and name those? And it was talking about grief and how if you look at what's happening and you know about the grief cycle, it can become easy to identify. And I believe that if you name it, you can solve it. And so what I want to do is see if I can give you some texture around that idea right now. And so as you're kind of working through these big emotions, hey, does this cycle of grief make sense? And is that a tool that I can use to extend grace to myself when things feel overwhelming? So I don't know how many of you all have ever dealt with the cycle of grief, but there are 5 parts to it. And so what I want to do is describe each of those cycles and see if you can't maybe find yourself or identify yourself in some of them. So when it comes to the cycle of grief, the first part is denial. And I will tell you right now, when it came to the pandemic, I was the biggest denier in the world. And I think it was twofold. First off, it was like, oh, how big could the flu be? You know, right? I mean, like we just didn't know what it was. And so it was just kind of very much that, oh, I know all this stuff is going on, but I can't believe it would be that big. But then I think the second part of denial too was just also a lack of knowledge, right? And, you know, we would see people saying things like, well, we only have 11 cases and soon it will be 0. And you don't really realize the impact of it. And so I know that right now, some of the denial that I find is New York Times is where I get all my news. And just today they had an article about how this could last well past summer. And I'm like, I'm just going to deny that, right? Because right now I'm not in the space that I could think about having to be in Lincoln, Nebraska for that long. So denial is the first part. Anger is the second piece of the cycle. And anger can feel like I'm angry that I'm stuck at home. Anger can feel like I'm super pissed at the school district because, you know, my kids aren't getting the education that they should. I'm super mad that I have to stay away from people and that I don't have the opportunity to participate in life the way that it was. What's interesting about anger is that anger is usually a secondary emotion and it's covering up something else, whether it's fear or sadness or anxiety. But when we're feeling it, it feels very, very weird. So, or very, very, very real. So that's the second cycle. The third part is bargaining. And I don't know if this sounds familiar to any of you all, but here's what bargaining looks like. Well, if I just stay in my house for 2 weeks, then I will be sitting Easter Sunday with all my friends in a packed church, right? So if I do this, then will I get this outcome that I am looking for? The next one is sadness. And so this is just kind of when we're like, oh, I have no idea like how long this is going to last. And I will know for me personally, sadness looks like me coming out as I miss going to Bison Witches with my friend Randy. I miss having an international trip on my calendar. I miss being able to go down to Kansas City and see my family without thinking about it. So for me, that's what sadness looks like. And then the final piece of it is acceptance. And so basically acceptance is just when you're like, and this is what I have to work with. This is it. And this is what I have to work with. And I bet as people that are participating in the startup world, this acceptance piece, and I actually think for business owners might come a little bit sooner rather than later, just because our whole livelihoods depend on figuring out what a situation is, and then how do we pivot and make it work so that, you know, we're not homeless. So anyhow, those are the 5 different parts of the grief cycle. And what I have found is I believe if you name it, you can solve it. And so when I am feeling a particularly big emotion, I simply go back to this and I say, hey, where am I in this? And one thing that I want you all to remember about the grief cycle is that it's not linear. and it goes all over and it goes back and forth and you can feel 12 things at once, but it is super, super real. And I think this can be a tool that you use to talk about what it is that you can do to maybe better understand all those big feelings that you're having. Another thing that this article talks about is this thing called anticipatory grief. And I remember when I read about this, it just kind of seemed like a light bulb went off. So anticipatory grief is usually something that we can recognize. So we have a fear of maybe a parent getting sick and dying. Maybe we have our own fear of death, and it's something that we can name. But what's been interesting about this whole thing with COVID-19 is we don't have an ending, right? And we don't necessarily know what that looks like. And so I kind of like to describe it as a storm is coming, but we don't necessarily know what that storm is. And so that can be really, really difficult to navigate just because of this very fuzzy future that we have. Something else that's really interesting about right now that I have found with myself, because I'm not going to lie, I feel that during this, there might be a lot of projection, right? I might be saying things as fact, but really it's just what I'm feeling. But one of the things that's interesting with what's happening now is like, we know it will end. Like we know that it will, but we have no idea when. And so that can also be really difficult to navigate. Something else that I want you all to kind of start thinking about is when it comes to what's going on, very, very rarely have we ever experienced such a collective grief, right? I have found comfort in talking about maybe my own feelings and what I'm going through by simply tagging on, and I'm not the only one, right? We are all experiencing this together. But in thinking about this whole concept of collective grief and that we're all experiencing this together, the one time that I can remember experiencing kind of the same thing is after 9/11. And I have no idea what your ages are, so I don't know if where you fell on that stage, but I remember I was 21 and I was bartending at Applebee's, and I remember the bars being packed after 9/11. And it wasn't necessarily because people were getting all drunk, but it was because I didn't want to be alone. And so it's been absolutely fascinating for me, at least, to watch this collective grief from the standpoint of, while we're all experiencing it, we have to experience it separately. And what I have found is that this can be really difficult because whether you're an introvert or an extrovert, we all need a sense of belonging. And so how do you navigate when your sense of belonging is a screen and Zoom and virtual? So just some things to think about with that. Now, I'm going to give you, so first off, I'm going to send that article to Danny, and you all read it, please. It's one of the best resources that I have found in kind of describing what's happening. But now what I want to do is give you all one of my most favorite tools when it comes to mental wellness, and that is something called a feelings wheel. So I believe that you all can raise your hands, and so I am curious, how many of you all out there, by a show of hands, love feelings? Like, you think that they are amazing and awesome and wonderful. Like, this is the awkward, like, oh, I have one hand. Okay, let's ask that question in a different way. Oh, two hands. Oh, how many of you all think feelings are dumb and you wish you didn't have them? Okay, how many of you all like feelings as long as they're good feelings? There we go. Now we got the hands raised, right? Yeah. So here's the thing about feelings. If you name it, you can solve it. And what I have found is that it can actually be really, really difficult to name what you're feeling, because when we are dealing with an emotion, usually we use really big words. And we use words like, I feel sad, I feel angry, I feel hurt. I feel happy, I feel excited. But the thing is that aside from those big words, there are so many other emotions. And what a feelings wheel does is it simply is a big old wheel full of feelings and gives you other words that you can use to better articulate what that specific feeling is. So I'm not gonna lie, I have a very fancy feelings wheel. This is very, very fancy. It's tactile, it's tangible. I can take it with me. I have actually pulled this out on a plane before. That's how much I love my feelings wheel. But I just want to show you that basically what it is it takes really big feelings and then it gives you different words to describe them. So anyhow, if you name it, you can solve it. And so this is just a tool to help you name that. I'll give you a quick example about this. This isn't going to be a pandemic example, but it's going to be a work example. I think that right now communication is really difficult, particularly with the people that we live with. And the reason that I say that is because, we were in situations where we had routines and we were moving about freely. And now we're in a situation like where while we may love our partners, like we see their faces a lot, and it can be really hard to kind of like articulate what we are feeling towards them. And what I have discovered is that when you're able to articulate an actual feeling that you are feeling, it opens up communication. And so, I guess I'll use a personal one, not a work one. But an example that I can think of is I remember I call him Complicated. That's my person. And he had done something. And if I was using my really big feelings word, I would say like he hurt me, right? Because that's a big word. But in actually articulating and looking at my wheel, what actually I found is that the word that better described it was insignificant. And here's why this matters. When you're going and having conversations and you're trying to articulate what it is that you are feeling, the more specific you are, the better shot you have at the other person understanding what you are thinking and being able to have a better understanding of whether or not they are going to change their behavior. So I do a lot of conflict resolution classes, and I will tell you that the feelings wheel is one of the greatest tools that I think people could use in having those difficult conversations. So anyhow, download your feelings wheel. I love it. They're free all over the internet, and give yourself the gift of being able to actually articulate what you are feeling. So next, in talking about feelings and mental wellness, what you need to remember about emotion or feelings is that emotion needs motion. And what that means is that if we don't allow ourselves to feel all of the things that don't go away, and I know that some of you all, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands, although you can, are people that are like, yeah, I don't feel, I just shove it deep on down there. I just keep on shoving. Well, here's the thing. Just because you shove or ignore feelings, they don't go away. And in fact, what happens is they come out at like the most inopportune times of the world, like, at the dinner table or in the middle of a movie or something like that. So anyhow, what I want you to start thinking about with regards to feelings is that emotion needs motion. And in just a second, I'm going to give you a tool on what you can do to help kind of move those feelings along. But before I do, I want to go ahead and acknowledge that I know that a lot of us don't like the big feelings because they feel overwhelming. And I think that sometimes we're afraid that, oh my gosh, if I let myself think about this anxiety that I have about what my business is going to look like, or if I actually allow myself to admit that I'm scared, that I don't know what the future holds, then that feeling isn't ever going to go away and it's going to become overwhelming. But the problem with this is that particularly with those feelings of like anxiety and fear, when we don't allow ourselves to feel them, they actually entrench on each other and get bigger and bigger and bigger. So anyhow, I want to give you right now a tool that you can use when you are dealing with negative feelings. Now, I do want you to know you can also do this with positive feelings as well, but I have found it to be more effective in dealing with maybe just kind of those, I don't feel so good right now. Okay, so when you are dealing with a really big feeling that you got from your feelings wheel, the first thing that you're going to do is give yourself permission to feel that feel and let it be as big as it needs to be. And if you need it to take up like every crevice of your body, let that happen. If you need to have it fill the whole room, that's fine. If you think it's going to be so big it'll fill the world, that's cool too. And the reason that you want to do this is because you simply want that emotion to be. I remember one time I did this on a plane, and my emotion was so big that I was certain that if I did this exercise, it would fill up like the whole aircraft and like the plane would crash. I don't know. just funny things that we think about. But anyhow, what was interesting is when I still allowed that to happen, how surprised I was that if I was thinking about a feeling in this as a physical space, it was about like this big. And I was like, oh, well, that doesn't feel overwhelming. And so it was a tool that I could use to, again, give myself space to feel that. So first, let it take up as much space as you need to. The second thing that I'm going to tell you to do is give yourself permission to feel that feeling as long as you need to. And so if you need to feel it a minute, feel it a minute. If you need to feel it a day, make it a day, a week, a month, a year, 10 years, I don't care. And the reason that you're going to do this is not because you're going to get stuck in negative feelings, but remember, emotion needs motion. So if you just give yourself permission to feel it, what you will discover is that what you feel right now and what you feel in 30 seconds to 3 minutes are going to be completely different things. And so I have used this particular exercise at least, 926 times a day in the past 4 months, or excuse me, in the past 4 weeks. So please, even if you were like, Marianne, I don't believe it is that magic of a tool, it is. And so give yourself permission to at least try. By the way, one thing that I think is really important to mention right now when it comes to this is I consider all of these things that I'm giving you to be secret human behavior. And here's what I mean by that. Like, we're talking about things that make a lot of people uncomfortable, and we're talking about things that can feel incredibly vulnerable. And so when I talk about the feelings wheel, this is a tool for you, right? Like, this is a tool for you to put in your pocket or hide in your desk so that you have it when you need it. When I talk about allowing yourself to feel the feels for as long as you need to, you don't need to post about it on Facebook, right? Like, if you're not comfortable doing that, these are not things that you share. So all of the tools that I'm giving you, at least in this first part, are all about gifts that you can give yourself, ways that you can extend generosity to yourself. Okay. So feel your feels. So next, I do want to talk about a specific feeling that I have heard a lot of people talk about, and that is anxiety. And so if you think about anxiety, what anxiety is it is fear plus uncertainty. So I'm afraid, and then I have all of this uncertainty, and that's when we start to get anxious. And so if you are somebody that deals with anxiety, I am going to give you 2 tools that I have found that help me kind of work through that. Now, I feel at this moment that I need to do like a little caveat, and that is that I am not a mental health professional. I do have my master's in organizational development, which is psychology, but I am not a therapist. And the only reason that I'm saying that is I think that there are some times when anxiety really is incredibly overwhelming, and we may need to see a professional for that. And so if that is you, please give yourself that gift. But these are 2 tools that I have found to be helpful for just normal anxiety, like not chronic or crippling, but normal. Okay. So by a show of hands, how many of you ever find yourself getting caught and anxious when you think about the future? Yeah, right. I mean, that's fear plus anxiety, or right, fear plus uncertainty equals anxious, and usually it's when we're thinking about the future. So the first thing that you can do when you get super anxious is I want you to bring yourself back into the moment. And I actually learned this tool from my therapist, and it was an exceptional tool, I thought, for kind of coming back into the present moment. And it's called the 3-2-1 tool. And so here's what it is. There you are, and you find yourself getting super anxious about what is happening in the future. And you're like, oh my gosh, and you're kind of going down this rabbit hole, and you're starting to feel overwhelmed. Well, what you're going to do is you are going to look around the room, and you are going to find name 3 things that you can see. And then after that, you are going to name 3 things that you can touch, and then 3 things that you can hear. So this is when we're putting in all of our senses, right? 3 things that I can see, 3 things that I can touch, 3 things that I can hear. Then you go into 2 things that I can see, 2 things that I can touch, 2 things that I can hear. And then you do 1 thing you can see, 1 thing you can touch, and 1 thing that you can hear. It is almost impossible. I would actually say it is impossible, but we're not supposed to live in a world of like always and nevers. But I think that it is nearly impossible to be anxious and thinking about the future and then have to focus right now on the things that are directly in front of you. So this is just a quick tool that you can use when it comes to getting yourself centered. So after you've done your centering tool, the next thing that you can do is ask yourself a series of questions. And so real quick, Danny, if I type in the chat room, can they see my questions?
Yes, as long as you
Okay.
put to all panelists and attendees, they'll be able to see it.
Cool. So y'all, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you the questions, but then I'm also going to type them in the chat room so that you can see what they are. And so if you miss one, you don't have to be like, wait, what was that third question? Okay, so I use these questions when I find myself being super overwhelmed with the unknown and telling myself stories that I have no evidence to prove. So so for example, I remember when the virus, I call it the virus, when the virus hit, I lost about $7,000 worth of work in like a time span of 12 hours. And so I was like, oh my gosh, if this is happening, like, how am I going to survive? And then add on top of that, that I had about $25,000 worth of proposals out there. And I'm like, what happens if all of those fall through? Right. And so I was getting into this mindset of like, I am never going to make another dollar. I don't know if that sounds familiar to any of you all, but as somebody that's a coach and a trainer, that's what I was thinking. I am never going to make another dollar in the world. So as I was going down that rabbit hole, that's when I pulled in these questions to actually get me out of that headspace. And so the very first question that I asked myself is that true? So is it true that I will never, ever, ever make another dollar? Well, at this point, I was like, I don't know. It might be, right? Just lost $7,000 worth of business. So that was my mindset. Second question I asked myself is, what evidence do you have to support that is true? And so what this does is it gives your head space to actually go, oh, okay. I'm in this nonsense space of I'm never going to make another dollar. So now let's figure out what evidence do I have to show that that is actually true. And so what I did is I stepped back and I was like, well, actually, I have none, because right after this whole $7,000 loss happened, I had another client that came in and actually contracted me for more work because I was able to do it virtually. Not only that, but it just happened to be that within the past 12 hours, people that had contracted me for future work were already sending me questions about if we could do the training virtually. So in other words, when I was able to step back and breathe and look at what evidence do I actually to have support that thought, I had none. Third question that I asked myself is, what other outcome could happen? So I don't know about you, but I have found as humans, like, we are amazing storytellers, right? Like, we're the most gifted storytellers in the world because it always involves us and it's always like the worst outcome ever. Like, really and truly, we are the best fiction writers in the world. And so what I do is, the next question that I ask myself is, what other outcome could happen, or what else might this look like? And what got really interesting with this is when creativity came into the picture. And so this is when I started to think about, well, you've been looking at releasing that online workbook, and now you have time to do that, and that is something that is virtual. So the outcome could be that you start to change your product offering. The outcome could be, I have wanted to build space in doing an online program. Well, now is the perfect time to do that. So this, to me, is the most calming question, right? Because this is when you're opening yourself up to creativity and pivots and all of that good stuff. Okay, next question. How do you feel when you think it is True. So in other words, when I go back to that thought of I'm never going to make $1 ever, ever, ever again, how do I feel? Well, terrible, right? Horrible, awful, scared, anxious, all of that jazz. Next question. How do I feel when I believe it is not true? So in other words, when I look at this scenario as, hey, you're not going to not make another dollar, but instead you're just going to actually go in and focus on things that you've already wanted to do, and now you have time. How do you feel? Well, the truth be told is how I felt was, okay, every crisis presents opportunity, and I am super fortunate that I have a gift and a skill that I can tweak what I do and have a different outcome. So in other words, I don't know if hopeful is the word, but I felt okay. Now, I don't know if you all believe me, but you have control over how you feel. And I know that sometimes it doesn't feel that way, but we always have a choice. And so the last question you're going to ask yourself is, how do I choose to feel? How do I choose to feel? So am I going to allow myself to completely get caught up in the anxiety, or am I going to give myself space to figure out how is it that I'm going to make this work? Now, I don't know if you all have thought about this, and you probably haven't, because I just put 2 and 2 together. But these questions can help also in trying to figure out where you are with the grief cycle. Because when you are choosing to say, you know what, I'm going to choose to pivot or make things different, that's going to be a sign that you're in the acceptance phase as well. And so this could actually help you move through the grief cycle, potentially, depending upon where you are in it. So just something to think about. Now, I'm going to give you another tool that you can use when you have this happening. So there you are, and you walk through, is that true? What evidence do I have? What other outcomes? And you finish that. After this, what you're going to want to do is figure out, are there any thought disruptors that I need? So let me tell you what a thought disruptor is. And this is a really good tool to use, not just necessarily in this particular scenario, but you can use it anytime you are feeling overwhelmed or having negative self-talk. And we all have negative self-talk. So if you are able to recognize when you get into those patterns, what you can do is do a thought interrupter. So here's what I mean by that. So even though I just asked myself these questions, and even though I've made the decision that, you know what, I'm going to focus on, we'll just say my online workbook, right? This is what I'm going to focus on, and I'm going to choose to feel okay about that. Anxiety and fear will still creep in. And so when I see that anxiety and fear creeps in, and I start to recognize that I'm going down that rabbit hole, what I do is I insert a thought disruptor. And that thought disruptor is a simple sentence that looks like, hey, you got this. Go find a tool that you can put in your workbook, right? And so basically what it does is it gets you out of that loop that you're going in. And once you recognize your loops, this can be incredibly effective when it comes to like stopping it from happening. Anyhow, yeah, those questions are really fantastic for if you're having a crisis of confidence. So one person asks you, makes one comment, all of a sudden your self-esteem is completely crushed. Guess what? Those questions will help you actually look at that situation. Those questions help when you are dealing with assumptions, and those questions help when you are dealing with storytelling as well. So those are some of my most favorite questions because they help you in so many different situations. What I'm going to encourage you all to do is take a note card and write those questions down, and then put that note card in a place where you can find it. And then what you can do is when you are dealing with anxiety or feeling overwhelmed, pull those out until they're memorized, and then it just becomes a really quick thought exercise you can do to bring you back into the present moment. Okay. Next tip that you can have for mental wellness and self-care, and that is let go of things that you cannot control. And oh my gosh, people say this all the time, right? You just need to let go of that. You can't control when your kids are going back to school. You can't control when shelter in place is lifted. All of that is true. You can't control that. But what I want you to do to counteract what you can't control is make a list of all of the things that you can control. And so I will give you a quick tip on this. The one thing that you can control is you. So you can control what tools you're going to use when things feel overwhelming. You can control how much sleep you get. You can control what time you wake up. You can control what time you eat lunch and what routine you put in place. And so what I have found is that when you make your list of things that you can control, when things feel out of control, you simply pick one thing on that list and say, this is what I'm going to do. Sometimes we just need really, really small things to make us feel like we have more control, and that list is going to help you do that. Okay, I have 3 more tips for you. So basically, that's my warning that time for your questions is coming up. So if you are having questions or thoughts, I know I use a fire hose of presenting style where I just spray information at you. You are in about 9 minutes going to have time to ask those questions. So heads up, that's coming. I love Q&A. It's my favorite. So getting your questions all ready to go in the Q&A would be awesome. Okay. Next tip for self-care and mental health. Take care of the basics. And when animals are wounded, they do 2 things. They rest and they return to water. So I'm going to sound like your mom when I say this, but the 2 things I'm going to encourage you all to do is make sure you are watching your water intake, right? Between every cup of coffee, drink a glass of water. Between every glass of wine, have water. Between every shot of whiskey, have water. Also, immerse yourself in it anytime you can. There's a reason they say to take a long hot bath or a long shower. That's because we are made of water, and so it is actually comforting to return to water. It's something that we should all have access to, so give yourself that gift. The second is let's talk to rest. Okay, I don't know, some of y'all might have hearts that break when I say this, but you should get between 7 and 9 hours of sleep every night. And if you aren't consistently getting that, when you have a lack of sleep, it will have the same effect on you as intoxication. And so I think that sometimes we underestimate the value of sleep, but I want you to remember that if you don't get enough of it, it can impair you just like being inebriated. So I believe that sleep cures all. I actually say that, #SCA. I just made that up. It's not trending anywhere. But with that not with that hashtag, but your body actually repairs itself when it sleeps. And I don't know if you've noticed this, but everything looks different in the morning. So when you give yourself time to sleep, the world just looks a little bit different. And that's because your body is resting and repairing during that time. So make sure you take care of the basics. By the way, that also includes eating. At this point, I don't care if you eat cupcakes all day. Just make sure that you are eating, right? Okay. Next, I want you to, during this time, make sure that you do your very best to extend generosity towards yourself. And I think that sometimes we can get really, really hard on ourselves and say things like, well, I shouldn't have snapped at that person, or I really wish I would have known that beforehand, or I wish I would have made a different decision, or why am I feeling this way? This is stupid. I shouldn't feel this way. I can't tell you how many times I have heard people say to me, I feel so guilty for being in a position where I haven't lost money. I feel so guilty for not feeling blessed that I haven't lost money. And I tell these people all the time, like, no. Like, extend grace and generosity to yourself with all the feelings that you're feeling. Now, having said that, I don't know if any of you all have ever behaved in the past, 3 or 4 weeks in a way that was unbecoming. While we need to extend grace to ourselves and realize that this is just a difficult time, every single person in this webinar should know how to say, I'm sorry. While we need to extend grace and generosity to ourselves, we also need to be able to apologize for our behavior when we behave in a way that is unbecoming towards somebody else. So just heads up, you need to learn to say that you are sorry. By the way, what you do is you say, I'm sorry I did that. That wasn't intended towards you. Here's what's going on. So that would be a script I would give you. And then finally, if you are extending grace and generosity to yourself, I'm going to ask you to extend grace and generosity to other people. By a show of hands, how many of you all have had somebody in your life in the past couple of weeks behave in a way that is out of the norm? Maybe they snap at you. Maybe they get short with you, miss a day. Yep. Okay. So if y'all are feeling all the feelings of stress and anxiety and fear and all of that, it would only make sense that other people are as well. And here's what happens. When somebody snaps at us or makes a snark comment, we tend to internalize and personalize. But particularly in this day and age, it is not ours to own. And so what I'm going to challenge you all to do is the next time that somebody does something that is out of character, I want you to tell yourself this. I want you to say, wow, that is uncharacteristic of Blake. I bet there's some strong emotion behind that. So what you're going to do is, instead of internalize and personalize that behavior, you are going to simply extend generosity by saying, wow, that was an unusual response from Blake. I bet there's some strong feelings behind that, right? Now, the second thing that I'm going to teach you all to do when it comes to extending grace and generosity to others is, how do you make a really good empathy statement? Because what I have found is that when you're able to look at a partner or a coworker or really anybody in your world and make a really strong empathetic statement, that what this does is it actually opens up dialogue as opposed to closing it down. So let me tell you how humans work. As humans, we are reactionary. And so what that means is that if Danny says something to me that I take personally, I become defensive. And when I become defensive, I'm going to respond in a defensive way, which is going to make Danny defensive, which is going to make me defensive. And you get stuck into that cycle of defensiveness. And once you are in that cycle, it is so hard to break it. And the way that you break it is by changing your response and your behavior. And the way that you can do that is with an empathetic statement. So here's the scenario. Danny and I work together, and I simply say, hey, Danny, where are we on this report? And he snaps back, I really can't even believe that you would bring that up. Seriously, right now, don't you know how busy I am? Well, I'm going to bet that we can all think of a time when somebody is snapped like that and we get defensive, and so we snap back. But in this situation, instead of getting defensive, what I'm going to do is I'm going to remind myself there's probably some strong emotion behind that response. And then I'm going to use a statement of empathy, which looks like this. You know what, Danny? I bet that right now, with all that's happening, that might be really overwhelming for you. And given all of the changes, I can see where trying to get everything done would be really frustrating. Is that true? So what you're doing is you are trying to acknowledge that Danny might be feeling overwhelmed and frustrated. And then by tacking on that, is that true? That is your curiosity and seeking to understand question. So what you're actually doing is opening up dialogue and creating a safe place for him to step back and say, you know what? Yeah, that is exactly true. I'm telling you what, here's what my world looks like right now. Or to do the exact opposite and for him to go, no, actually what I'm feeling right now is the kid was sick this morning, or my wife is worried about losing her job, or whatever that case may be. And so your statement of empathy will completely change the outcome in a difficult situation, and it will simply allow the person to exhale and participate in dialogue, as opposed to contributing to that defensive cycle. So anyhow, those are all of my quick tips for you. So that's what I got. And so now I'm open to questions. Lots of questions.
Marianne, I have a question to kick things off.
Please.
This is Olivia. My question is surrounding identifying the feelings of anxiety. I think maybe some folks, and maybe even myself, sometimes has a hard time distinguishing anxiety from other feelings. So do you have any sort of tactical strategies for how people can start to identify when they actually are having anxious thoughts or feelings?
Yeah. So usually, that's a great question. So usually anxiety is going to be coupled with the feelings of stress. So when you are actually dealing with anxiety, this is going to be when your heart races. This is going to be when your blood pressure feels elevated, because what anxiety is that is a feeling of being in survival mode. And what happens when that happens is we have adrenaline pumping through our veins, and we have cortisol pumping through our bodies. And so we have an elevated heart rate, and we have elevated um, blood pressure. And so what I would tell you to do is, when it comes to trying to identify, like, hey, is this anxiety, or is this just being sad, or is this just being feelings of overwhelmedness? I want you to look at that physical response and see what that is. Like, are you not necessarily thinking crystal clear? Are you almost getting in that fight or flight mode? Like, right now, do I want to just like hunker down and stay silent, or am I ready to start lashing out at everybody? And so I think that if you look for those two things, physical response, and then am I finding myself in fight or flight mode, that could be a key that it is anxiety as opposed to a different type of feeling.
Awesome. Thank you.
Well, you're welcome.
And yeah, I can actually keep the questions going here, and to all our attendees, remember, the Q&A right down there is for everybody. But Marianne, in continuing on with, strategies for, recognizing your anxiety and calming yourself down. Now, a lot of people I know, are getting really anxious before they're going to bed. Especially, a lot of people are having trouble falling asleep, staying asleep. Do you have any strategies, that you might use yourself, or that I could implement to really calm my anxieties before something like that, a routine like that?
Yeah. So when it comes to sleep, I tell everybody that first off, you need to have a bedtime routine. And what you do the hour before you go to bed is what your routine is. And here's the thing about bedtime routines, I don't care what they are. It can be anything from I drink a relaxing cup of tea and then read a book, all the way to I watch an episode of Law and Order SVU, right? I don't care what that routine is. You just need to have one. Part of that routine also needs to be going to bed at the same time and waking up at the same time. Even on weekends. I know that people are like, I can't believe you just said that, but even on weekends, let your body have that routine. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that if you find yourself being anxious or you can't sleep, lie still. And when I talk about lying still, that means that you cannot even wiggle your toes. Now, you will be very uncomfortable because you cannot wiggle your toes. But here's the thing. When we can't sleep, we toss and we turn. We get up and we go to the restroom. We go grab a snack and we check our phones. Y'all, nobody in the history of ever has fallen asleep with a snack in one hand and their phone in the other. And so what you want to do is give your body time to actually rest. And you do that by not moving. I will say that when I was on the road, I don't have control over the hotels that I sleep at. And so this was my tried and true trick when it came to I need rest, but I'm not necessarily feeling the most comfortable, or I'm not in my own bed. The next thing that you can do is, if you're somebody that has to have white noise in the background, there's a podcast out there called Sleep With Me. No, excuse me, not nearly as exciting as it sounds. But the sole purpose of this podcast is to be so boring that you would rather sleep than listen to what this person has to say. Y'all, it is that boring. I remember one time he had an episode on like shopping for earrings at Kmart. And I have no idea why at this particular time I thought that that would be interesting to listen to, but I had like talked myself into like listening to the full episode. By the time the intro was done, I was fast asleep. So you can also try that, particularly if you need background noises. Again, the podcast is called Sleep With Me. And then finally, my last tip for sleeping is not sound like a drug pusher, but Target has a brand of vitamins called Olly, O-L-L-Y. They are all natural. And what they have one called Sleep Well. And it has been my experience that if you take that as part of your bedtime routine, right? Please don't take it at 3 a.m. But if you take it as part of that bedtime routine, particularly when you are feeling more anxious, that can have a very calming effect. I will say that this vitamin is my tried and true for jet lag. So when I get back to the States, quite often the very next day, I will have to go back into just doing like normal job routines. And this is the vitamin that I use to make sure that I get that sleep so that I don't have to experience jet lag. So those are my quick tips for sleeping.
Awesome. And we got one question here. So what are you doing to cure, if it even is a thing, boredom?
Okay, so so let's see. To cure boredom, my dog and I played tic-tac-toe the other night. And I recorded that and put that on Facebook, right? Because what else are you going to do other than play tic-tac-toe for your dog? So you can do really dumb things like that. Like you see somebody else do something dumb on Facebook. I actually am the kind of person that's like, hey, I'm going to do that too. So don't be afraid to try some of those things that you see. But then also, this is the time to give in to those weird things that pop into your brain. So for example, I have not baked cupcakes in a decade. And then a couple of weeks ago, because I was bored, I was like, here's how it happened. I want a cupcake. And so I sent my friend a text and I'm like, hey, will you ask your stepmom to make me cupcakes? And then I was like, this is ridiculous. I do not need somebody to make me cupcakes. I will make them myself. And so what I've done is been really, really careful about when an idea pops up into my brain, actually going and doing it. So like last night, I bought a whole bunch of stuff for a container garden because I've always wanted to do a container garden. Right now, it seemed like a good idea. I'm not necessarily sure that these things bring energy and enthusiasm and excitement to your world, but they do keep you occupied. And oftentimes when you're doing something, whether it's baking a cupcake, creating a container garden, playing tic-tac-toe with your dog, something like that, it's actually just a distraction, and sometimes distraction is better than boredom. So those are my quick tips for that. I'm trying to think of other weird things I've done. Oh, I read, by the way, this is the pandemic book. It's called Just Listen by Mark Goldstein. And when I say pandemic book, it's not about a pandemic. But if there is one read that everybody needs to read, it is this one. I am obsessed with this book. I have completely updated all of my training based on this book. This is where I learned to extend quote unquote generosity to other people. And so if you're trying to figure out like, hey, I just want a great book that will give me tips and tricks and tools on how to be more generous towards others, it is this. I will let you know there's also a sales element to this. So it's not just about personal life, it is about professional life as well. So if you're trying to figure out how do I close better, how do I use psychology hacks to get people to be more open to my product, this works with that as well.
Awesome. And we have about 2 minutes left, so we got time for one last question here. And this kind of goes back to getting into a routine, sticking to it. What are some tips? What are some small tips you give to somebody to nudge myself into a routine and sticking to it rather than going back to all my vices?
Oh my gosh. Okay, so I will tell you about how to create a habit. So I don't know if any of this sounds familiar to you all, but I always talk about New Year's resolutions, right? So it's the new year, it's a new start, particularly this year because it was like a new decade, right? And so we say, oh, I'm going to eat better, or I'm going to lose weight, or I'm going to start a business, or whatever. Well, here's the thing. Usually we fail at that. And so when you're talking about creating habits to help you not fall into your vices, it's because the habits that we try to create are huge. So 2 tips on creating new habits. First, a new habit should take 2 minutes or less. So instead of saying I'm just going to use healthy eating because that's one that I hear a lot. So instead of saying, oh, my new habit is I'm going to be a better, eat more healthy. And so I'm going to go through my kitchen and dump out all of the junk food and only bring fruits and vegetables in. Well, this is setting yourself up for failure. So instead, what that new habit would look like is when I drive to work, I'm going to eat an apple, right? Eating an apple, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, but it's something small. The second thing that you want to do in creating a habit is you want to attach it to something that you already do. So for example, I hear some people say, oh, I want to practice meditation and mindfulness. I hear that all the time. And so they try to set aside, they download all these apps and they try to set aside like 30 minutes a day. Well, what I would actually recommend that you do is when you wake up in the morning, you do a 2-minute meditation because 1, it's 2 minutes, but 2, waking up is just something that you already do. And so that's another thing that you can do is make sure that you attach it to something that you're already doing. Just like eating the apple, we used to live in a world where you're already driving to work, so you're attaching that to something that you're already doing. So quick tips on that.
Awesome. And thank you so much, Marianne. I will take over here to close it out for you. But, and thank you to all our attendees today. I really appreciate y'all coming in. This, for those of you that may have missed something or want to share this, know that it will be up on our research page, Vimeo page, and YouTube page within the next day or two. Just give us some time to upload it there. But again, thank you very much. Hope tomorrow is our last day of these webinars. Hope to see you tune in. Feel free to please share the information with anyone in your network interested. We have resources and strategies for nonprofits during this time, and a very interesting one on how to use this downturn to sharpen your sword and make a stronger comeback. So again, I want to thank Marianne and all our attendees for joining today, and Marianne again for speaking to all this. Again, my email is danny@generator.com. Please reach out if you'd like any follow-up information or anything continued. I'll also make sure when Marianne shares the link to that article to share it with everybody. But thank you so much for attending today, and hope to see you again soon.
Bye.
Thank you all. Thanks, Marianne. This was awesome.
Awesome. Bye, all. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you.